My grandson Arthur called me on a Saturday morning in February and said, "Grandpa, I found something you should know about." He said it with the careful hesitation of a 26-year-old who has discovered something he is not certain he should have discovered and who is not yet sure what it means, but who has decided that telling me is more important than protecting whoever might be implicated by the telling. I said, "Tell me." He said, "I've been doing some research on the family history for a project, and I found something in the county land records about the lighthouse property. There's a document I don't understand. It looks like a transfer was filed, but you're still living there." I was quiet for a moment. He said, "Grandpa, are you there?" I said, "I'm here, Arthur." He said, "Do you know about this?" I said, "Yes, I found it 3 weeks ago." A silence. He said, "3 weeks." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you didn't tell anyone?" I said, "I was waiting until I understood the full shape of it, and until I had done what needed to be done." He said, "What did you do?" I said, "Come to the house on Sunday, I'll show you." What Arthur did not know when he made that call on a Saturday morning in February was that the document he had found in the county records was only the surface of what was there. He had found the transfer filing. I had found what was underneath it. The difference between those two things was the difference between finding the symptom and finding the cause, and I had spent 35 years in a profession where the difference between those two things was the difference between a ship that sailed and a ship that did not. This is the story of what happens when a grandson and his grandfather find the same secret from different directions, and what a family looks like when it decides to be honest about what it has been hiding. My name is Bert Calloway. I am 71 years old. I was born in Portsmouth, Virginia, the son of a naval shipyard worker who spent 30 years building and repairing vessels for the United States Navy, and who understood, with the particular clarity of a man who works with his hands on things that must not fail, that every structure has a load-bearing element, and that finding that element and understanding it is the most important thing you can do before you do anything else. I studied naval architecture and marine engineering at Virginia Tech, spent 3 years at a shipbuilding company in Newport News, and founded Callaway Marine Consulting in 1986. Over 35 years, we became a respected small firm specializing in structural analysis, load distribution studies, and forensic engineering. I was not famous in my industry. I was trusted, which in marine engineering is more important. I sold the firm 8 years ago to a larger engineering group in Baltimore when I was ready to retire. I retired to the house on the Virginia coast near Chincoteague that my wife Frances and I had bought in 2001. The lighthouse is the property Arthur found in the records. It is a decommissioned Coast Guard light station 400 meters from our house, accessible by a gravel path. Frances and I purchased it from the GSA in 2003 for $140,000 and spent 3 years restoring it. The lighthouse itself, a 42-foot brick tower built in 1887, is structurally sound and carefully maintained. The keeper's cottage beside it was renovated into a guest house. Frances passed 5 years ago. Breast cancer, diagnosed late. She was 65 years old, and we had been married for 40 years. She had managed the lighthouse restoration contractors and permits and historic preservation requirements, and had loved the finished structure with the pride of someone who has built something that was not supposed to be possible. The lighthouse property is valued at approximately $1.6 million. It is titled in my name. It was titled in my name on the day Arthur called me. It was also titled, as of 8 months earlier, in a document I had found in the county land records 3 weeks before Arthur's call, in the name of my son Richard. Richard is my son. He is 44 years old, lives in Richmond with his wife Caroline and their 2 children. He works in commercial real estate and is good at it in the way of someone who has inherited a facility for structural thinking and applied it to a different kind of structure than his father did. I want to be fair to Richard. He is not a bad person. He called me every week after Frances passed and visited every 6 weeks and was genuinely kind in the months following her death. What he was also, in those same months, was attentive to the lighthouse property in ways I had noticed but not yet named. He asked about maintenance costs, insurance, upkeep. He asked twice whether I had thought about simplifying my estate structure. I had answered honestly because I had not yet understood the direction. Arthur studies history at a university in Charlottesville. He is patient and precise and willing to follow a document trail wherever it leads, regardless of whether the destination is comfortable. He had been working on a family history project when he found the land records. He had not been looking for anything unusual. He had been looking for the original deed to the lighthouse property. What he found instead was a transfer document filed 8 months after I thought we owned it clean. I had found the document on a Tuesday evening in January when I was going through the lighthouse's property records in preparation for a conversation with my homeowner's insurance company about updating the coverage on the keeper's cottage. The county recorder's online system showed 4 recorded documents for the lighthouse property. The original transfer from the GSA in 2003, a mortgage satisfaction from 2008 when we paid off the renovation loan, a deed correction filed in 2011 that fixed a surveying error in the property description, and a 4th document, filed 8 months ago, that described itself as a quitclaim deed, transferring my ownership interest in the property to Richard Allen Calloway. I had not signed a quitclaim deed. I had not been asked to sign a quitclaim deed. I had not had any conversation with Richard or anyone else about transferring the lighthouse property to Richard. I looked at the document for a long time. Then I printed it. Then I sat at the kitchen table in the house on the coast, and I read every word of it twice. The document was notarized. The signature above my name was a reasonable approximation of my signature. Not perfect. Close enough to pass a routine review. The notary seal was from a firm in Richmond. I called my attorney the following morning. Her name was Sandra Briggs. She had handled the lighthouse purchase and the renovation financing and had updated my estate documents when Frances passed. She was 58 and methodical, and she had a quality I had come to rely on, which was that she did not speculate. She dealt in what was documented and what was not, and she did not confuse the two. I told her what I had found. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Bert, send me a copy of the document immediately. And pull the recording information, the date, the document number, the submitting party." I sent it within the hour. She called back that afternoon. She said, the submitting party was a title services company in Richmond. I'm going to find out who engaged them. I said, how long will that take? She said, give me a week. I said, Sandra, I want to be certain before I say anything to anyone. Complete certainty, whatever that takes. She said, I understand. She called me 11 days later. The title services company in Richmond had been engaged by a real estate attorney named Paul Garrett, who had offices in downtown Richmond and who had represented, according to Sandra's research, several of Richard's commercial real estate transactions over the previous 6 years. Sandra had pulled Paul Garrett's client engagement records through a process she described as routine professional inquiry. Richard Allen Calloway was listed as a client of Paul Garrett's firm dating back 4 years. The quitclaim deed had been submitted to the county recorder by Paul Garrett's office on behalf of Richard Allen Calloway. Sandra said, Bert, do you want me to tell you what this means legally, or do you already know? I said, tell me anyway. She said, the quitclaim deed, if unchallenged, transfers your ownership interest in the lighthouse property to Richard. It would give him the authority to sell the property, mortgage it, or transfer it further without your involvement. The signature on the deed is not yours, which means the document was executed fraudulently. The question is whether Richard directed Paul Garrett to file a fraudulent document or whether something else is happening that I haven't found yet. I said, what else might be happening? She said, it's possible that Richard was acting on what he believed was a prior agreement or understanding that he had not yet discussed with you. Some people do extraordinarily reckless things when they are convinced they already have permission they have not formally received. I said, and if he was not acting on a prior understanding? She said, Then this is fraud, and you have a clear legal case. I said, what do I need to do? She said, first, we file a challenge to the quitclaim deed with the county recorder and establish your continued ownership. That's done. I filed it yesterday. I said, and second? She said, you talked to your son. I said, I need to understand what he believed he was doing before I do that. She said, do you have a way to find that out? I said, I think I might. Give me 2 weeks. What I did over the following 2 weeks I will describe because the method matters. The first thing I did was pull every document related to my estate that Richard had seen or been involved in since Frances passed. This included the will, which I had shared with both Richard and Arthur's younger sister Claire when I updated it after Frances's death, and 2 conversations I had had with Richard about estate planning in the 18 months following Frances's passing. In both of those conversations, Richard had raised the lighthouse property specifically. He had suggested, on the first occasion, that it might make sense to transfer the property to him now rather than through the estate, to simplify the eventual transition. I had said I would think about it and had not thought further about it. On the second occasion, he had suggested that given my age and the complexity of maintaining a historic property alone, a family trust with him as trustee might be appropriate. I had said the existing arrangements were sufficient. I had not understood these conversations as a sequence. Looking at them together, 3 weeks after finding the quitclaim deed, I understood them as the preparation for what had been filed. The second thing I did was research Paul Garrett's recent transactions involving Richard. Sandra had given me the document numbers. I pulled the associated records from the county recorder's database, a skill I had developed over 35 years of working with permits and structural documentation, and I found 2 additional documents filed in the previous year. Both were related to commercial properties Richard had been involved with. Both had been submitted through Garrett's office. Neither was problematic. The lighthouse deed was the only anomalous document. The third thing I did was look at Richard's financial situation. I did this carefully and through legitimate channels, primarily through the public business records of the companies he had been involved with, and through a conversation with a colleague of mine who worked in commercial real estate finance and who was willing to give me a general picture without specifics. What I found was that Richard had been having a difficult year. 2 commercial projects had stalled. A partnership had dissolved under circumstances that were not publicly described, but that my colleague characterized as contentious. Richard was not in financial crisis, but he was in a position where a significant asset would have been useful. I sat with all of this for 3 days before I decided what to do next. Then Arthur called. Arthur arrived on Sunday afternoon with the particular focused energy of someone who has been thinking about a problem continuously since they first encountered it, and who has many questions and is trying to decide which one to ask. First, I made coffee. We sat in the kitchen that faces the water. Through the window, we could see the lighthouse tower at the end of the gravel path, the brick darkened by salt air and the light at the top dark as it had been since the Coast Guard decommissioned it in 1998. I put Sandra's file on the table between us. I told him everything in the order I had found it. He listened without interrupting, which is not a common quality in 26-year-olds, and which told me more about his character than anything he could have said. When I finished, he said, "Dad did this." I said, "The document was filed by his attorney on his behalf." "Yes," he said. "Does he know you found it?" I said, "No." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to give him the opportunity to explain it to me himself." Arthur said, "What if he doesn't?" I said, "Then I will ask him directly." He said, "And if he lies?" I said, "Then I will show him what I have." Arthur looked at the file on the table. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Grandpa, why did you wait 3 weeks?" I said, "Because I needed to be certain, and because I wanted to give your father the chance to come to me before I went to him." He didn't take it. He said, "He doesn't know you know." I said, "No, he doesn't." Arthur looked at the lighthouse through the window. He had spent summers here as a child. He had climbed the tower with me when he was 8 years old and stood at the top and looked out at the water and asked me why the lighthouse was built where it was, and I had explained about the shoals and the shipping lanes and the particular geography that made this exact location necessary. He had listened with the attention of a child who understands that the answer to a question can itself contain more questions and who is willing to stay with it until the questions resolve. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to be present when I speak with your father, not to intervene, not to accuse, just to be there." He said, "When?" I said, "I'm going to call him this evening." Richard arrived on Wednesday afternoon. I had told him only that I wanted to see him and that there was something I needed to discuss about the lighthouse property. I had not told him Arthur would be there. When he walked through the door and saw Arthur sitting at the kitchen table, he stopped for a moment. Something crossed his face, not guilt exactly, more like recalibration. He sat down. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table with the lighthouse visible through the window. I said, "Richard, I want to give you the opportunity to tell me about the quitclaim deed before I show you what I have." He said, "Dad." I said, "Let me finish. I found the document 3 weeks ago. I have had it reviewed by Sandra, and I understand its legal significance. I know it was filed by Paul Garrett's office. I know when it was filed, and I know what the recording shows. Before I say anything else, I want to give you the chance to tell me in your own words what happened." A long silence. Richard looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at him with the neutral attentiveness of someone who has decided to observe rather than react. Richard said, "I thought you were going to sign it." I said, "Explain that to me." He said, "We talked twice about transferring the lighthouse. You said you'd think about it. I thought we had an understanding. Paul said if we filed it and you didn't challenge it, it would simplify the transition. I thought it would be cleaner." I said, "You filed a document with my forged signature because you believed I would not object to what the document said." He said, "It's not forged, it's..." I said, "Richard, the signature is not mine. The notarization is false. That is the definition of a forged document, regardless of what you believed about my intentions." He was quiet. I said, "Did you need the lighthouse?" A silence, longer than the others. He said, "There was a project. I needed to show assets. I thought if I had the lighthouse in my name, I could use it as collateral for 30 days and then transfer it back before you ever noticed." I said, 30 days. He said, "The project fell through anyway. It doesn't matter now." I said, "It matters to me." Arthur said nothing. He was looking at his father with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone watching a person they love reveal a dimension of themselves that is disappointing and that cannot be unseen. I said, "I filed a challenge to the quitclaim deed 3 weeks ago. Sandra has documented everything. The lighthouse is in my name, and it will remain in my name." I paused. "I am not going to report this to the authorities. You are my son, and what you did was reckless and wrong, and it came from a place of financial pressure that you should have told me about instead of this. But I am not going to make a criminal matter of it." Richard said, "Dad." I said, "I am going to tell you what is going to happen instead. You are going to sit down with me and Sandra, and we are going to review every document related to my estate and every conversation we have had about the lighthouse property. You are going to tell me the full truth about your financial situation and about what you thought you were doing. And we are going to establish in writing a clear understanding of what this family's assets are and who they belong to and what the process is for any future conversations about those assets." He said, "Okay." I said, "And you are going to explain this to Arthur, not because I am requiring it, but because he found the same document you filed and he came to me with it immediately. He deserves to understand from you what happened." Richard looked at his son. Arthur looked back at him. I stood up. I went to the window and looked at the lighthouse, the brick dark with salt, the light at the top dark and still, Frances had loved that tower more than any other part of the property. She had said once that she liked the idea of something built to warn people away from danger. I had told her that was not quite right, that it was built to guide people toward safety. She had said those were the same thing from different directions. I turned back to the table. I said, "The coffee is still hot." The meeting with Sandra took place 2 weeks later. Richard came alone. He sat in Sandra's conference room and he told the full truth about his financial situation, which was more precarious than I had understood and which required a kind of help that was significantly more modest than what he had tried to take without asking. I helped him, not with the lighthouse, with a direct loan documented by Sandra, with terms that were fair to both of us, and that Richard has been repaying without exception every month since. Arthur and Richard had their conversation privately. I do not know what was said because it was not mine to know. What I observed in the weeks following was that Arthur called his father more frequently and that the calls were different from before, shorter in some ways and more direct in every way that counted. Sandra filed the final paperwork establishing the lighthouse property in an irrevocable trust with me as trustee and Nathan and Claire as successor trustees. The trust specifies that the property is to be maintained as a historic structure and cannot be developed or converted for any purpose inconsistent with its historic character. Richard is named as a beneficiary of the trust, but not as a trustee. He signed the trust documents without objection. The lighthouse tower was inspected by a structural engineer in the spring. She found it in excellent condition for a building of its age and noted 3 areas requiring minor maintenance over the next decade. I have scheduled the work. Arthur came back for a weekend in April. We walked the gravel path to the lighthouse together the way we had when he was a child, and I showed him the structural report and explained what the engineer had found and what the maintenance would involve. He asked good questions the way he always had. At the top of the tower, he looked out at the water and said, "Grandpa, were you angry at Dad?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you still?" I said, "I am something more complicated than angry. I am disappointed in the choice he made, and I am sad that he believed he had to make it, and I am grateful that it is resolved and that he told the truth when I gave him the chance to." He said, "What would you have done if he hadn't told the truth?" I said, "I had everything I needed to address it legally. I would have done what was necessary." He said, "But you gave him the chance first." I said, "I always give people the chance first. That is the method." He looked at the water for a moment. Then he said, "I found the same document you found." I said, "I know." He said, "But you found it 3 weeks earlier and you had already done everything by the time I called." I said, "Yes." He said, "How did you know what to do?" I said, "I have been reading structural documents for 40 years. Every structure has a load-bearing element. You find it, you understand it, and then you know what you are working with." He looked at the lighthouse tower around him, at the brick walls built in 1887 that had carried the weight of the light and the weather and now carried the weight of all the things we had put into it, the restoration and Frances's love for it, and the particular history of a family that had found it and claimed it and were now, in their imperfect way, trying to protect it. He said, "The lighthouse." I said, "Yes. I am 71 years old. I spent 35 years finding the load-bearing elements of structures and understanding them before anything else. That method does not stop being useful when you retire. It becomes, if anything, more necessary. What Richard did came from pressure and from a belief, which I think he had held for some time without examining it, that what was going to be his eventually was his already in some practical sense, and that moving it into his name was therefore not theft but merely a scheduling adjustment. That belief is wrong. It is wrong legally, and it is wrong morally, and it is wrong in the specific way that assumptions about inheritance are always wrong, which is that they substitute a desired future for the actual present and act as though the person whose assets they concern has already ceased to matter. I have not ceased to matter. Frances has not ceased to matter. The lighthouse she loved and helped build is still here, and it is ours, and it will be ours in the ways that count for as long as I am alive to ensure it. Arthur found the document and came to me with it immediately. That matters. It tells me something about who he is, and about the kind of honesty he is willing to practice, even when the subject of that honesty is someone he loves. That quality is worth more than any property. The load-bearing element of a family, I have come to understand, is not the assets. It is the honesty. Find it, protect it, maintain it. Everything else is structure built on top of it. And when that element is compromised, everything above it becomes unstable, not because the assets are gone, but because the trust that made them meaningful is gone with them. Richard is rebuilding that trust. It takes longer than 30 days. It takes longer than a year. But it is being rebuilt, and I can see it in the calls and the visits, and the way he looks at the lighthouse now when he comes to the coast, not as something he tried to take, but as something he is learning, again, to be grateful for. Tell me in the comments, has someone in your family ever taken something they thought was already theirs? I want to hear from you.